a bridge that took nearly a decade to design and build. Gone in under a minute in 2 coordinated waves separated by roughly an hour. And the strangest part of this story isn't the strike itself, it's what came after it. Nothing. No angry press conference, no retaliation announcement, no fiery statement from state television, no warning of consequences, no list of targets identified in response. Just silence. And when a government that has answered almost every single strike this year with something, a statement, a threat, a counterstrike, suddenly goes completely quiet, that silence stops being an absence of news. It becomes the news. Hello, and welcome back, everybody. Today we're breaking down the strike on what officials are calling Iran's last fully intact major highway bridge linking the capital to the western provinces, why the timing of this strike was almost certainly not an accident, and the deafening quiet that followed it, which multiple analysts now say may be more strategically significant than the strike itself. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what this bridge meant to Iran structurally and symbolically, how this fits into a much larger pattern that's been building for months, why Tehran's silence is being read in at least 3 completely different ways by people who study this conflict closely, what this single strike is actually costing Iran in hard economic terms, and what to actually watch for in the days ahead, because a silence this unusual almost never lasts. This is a long one, so settle in, because there's a lot to unpack here. Let's start with the stakes, because you genuinely cannot understand why the silence matters until you understand exactly what was destroyed. For years, Iran maintained essentially one primary elevated highway connection linking Tehran to the western provinces and onward toward the Caspian corridor. This wasn't an ordinary overpass sitting quietly in the background of daily commuter life. Engineers who worked on the project have described it as one of the tallest and most structurally ambitious bridges anywhere in the Middle East, built using a rare hybrid system that supports the roadway through both suspension cabling and reinforced arches simultaneously. That kind of dual support engineering is genuinely difficult to execute correctly, and it took the better part of a decade to plan, engineer, and finally complete. When it was finished, state media didn't treat it like just another piece of transport infrastructure. They treated its opening as a genuine showcase moment, a way of demonstrating to the rest of the region that Iranian engineers could design and build something on par with the biggest infrastructure projects found anywhere else in the world. That context matters enormously because this wasn't the first time a bridge on this exact corridor had been hit this year. Earlier in this conflict, a sister structure on the same route, arguably the more famous and more photographed of the two, was struck and effectively taken out of operation entirely. Its main span was sliced clean through at the midpoint by the sheer force of the blasts, according to engineers who visited the site during a press tour organized shortly afterward. 8 people were killed in that earlier strike and dozens more injured, many of them civilians with no connection whatsoever to any military activity happening nearby. Some of the victims, according to local officials, were simply out enjoying a public holiday near the riverbank when the strike occurred. The loss of that first bridge alone was treated at the time as a major symbolic and logistical blow to the country. But it left this second, newer bridge, the one we're discussing today, as the last fully functioning heavy load crossing on that entire western corridor. Which means what happened this time isn't simply another bridge got hit. It is the removal of the very last structural link holding an entire regional transport corridor together. Think about what actually depends on a single crossing point like this. Every commercial truck moves goods between the capital and the western provinces. Every fuel tanker keeps regional gas stations stocked. Every bus carries ordinary commuters to work each morning. Every ambulance responding to an emergency on the wrong side of that river. And whether officials want to admit it publicly or not, any military logistics that might need to move material along that same route. All of it now has nowhere else to go, or at best, a detour that adds significant time, fuel cost, and wear onto vehicles that weren't built for a much longer alternate route. This is precisely the logic behind what analysts have started calling a de-development campaign. A deliberate, sustained effort to dismantle a country's ability to move people, fuel, and material internally, not by targeting soldiers or military bases directly, but by targeting the physical connective tissue an entire economy depends on to function on a completely ordinary day. It's a slower, quieter kind of warfare than a headline-grabbing airstrike on a military installation, but arguably a far more corrosive one, because it doesn't just remove a capability, it removes a convenience that an entire population has built its daily life around, and it does so in a way that's very difficult to reverse quickly. One retired logistics officer, who has been closely tracking Iran's infrastructure losses throughout this war, summarized it bluntly in a recent interview. Bridges are choke points, and choke points are very often where a war is actually decided, long after the missile strikes themselves have stopped generating headlines and moved off the front page. You can win every individual tactical engagement and still functionally lose ground in a conflict simply because nothing, no goods, no fuel, no people, can move where it needs to go anymore without enormous friction and delay. That is exactly the position Iran now finds itself in on this particular corridor, and it's worth sitting with that fact for a moment before we move forward, because it reframes absolutely everything that follows in this story. So how exactly did we arrive at this specific moment? Because nothing about this strike happened in isolation, and understanding the full buildup is essential to understanding why the silence that followed it is so genuinely unusual. This war has moved through distinct, clearly escalating phases since it began back in late February, when an opening wave of strikes eliminated senior Iranian leadership almost overnight, including the country's supreme leader and a long list of top military and political officials. That opening phase alone reshaped the entire conflict, because it removed decades of institutional continuity in a matter of hours. In the months since, the campaign against Iran has methodically widened in scope, moving through one phase after another, almost like chapters in a single unfolding book. First came direct strikes on military assets and defensive positions. Then the focus shifted toward naval capability across the Strait of Hormuz, as Iran responded to the initial strikes by threatening to close one of the most economically vital waterways on the planet, a choke point through which roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil supply normally passes. That naval phase escalated further into a full blockade of Iranian ports, cutting off shipping traffic almost entirely, and forcing a costly, technically demanding mine clearance operation that took the U.S. Navy months to complete, using a combination of destroyers, specialized mine countermeasure vessels, and increasingly autonomous underwater drones designed to keep human divers out of harm's way. And then, more recently, the campaign pivoted deliberately toward infrastructure. That pivot began with an unusually blunt public ultimatum from the American side, a direct threat to specifically target bridges and power plants across Iran if Tehran did not relinquish control over the Strait of Hormuz by a stated deadline. This wasn't a vague warning buried in a diplomatic cable. It was stated publicly and bluntly, framed at one point almost casually as a kind of deadline event, with officials naming bridges and power infrastructure specifically as the next category of targets if the ultimatum wasn't met. Within days of that ultimatum expiring, the first major bridge strike occurred. The sister structure mentioned a few minutes ago, killing civilians who happened to be nearby and drawing sharp condemnation from international human rights observers. Several of those observers argued publicly and forcefully that deliberately targeting civilian transport infrastructure crosses a line that most modern military campaigns have historically tried hard to avoid, precisely because of the humanitarian and legal risk involved in striking structures that ordinary civilians rely on every single day. Structures with no direct military function of their own. But the campaign did not stop at a single bridge. And this is the part that often gets lost underneath the day-to-day headline cycle. In the weeks that followed, strikes expanded methodically to bridges and rail infrastructure feeding Iran's southern ports, specifically aimed at severing the connection between Bandar Abbas, Iran's single most important port, and the road networks leading north toward the capital. Power infrastructure was hit around the same period as well, forcing the country's energy ministry to publicly request that southern provinces reduce their electricity consumption voluntarily, an unusually candid admission for a government that generally prefers to project strength rather than strain. A maritime control tower in the port city of Chabahar, on the Gulf of Oman side, sustained visible damage during this same stretch, with officials posting images of the structure collapsing under a plume of smoke. Meanwhile, the naval blockade running in parallel to all of this was reportedly costing Iran an extraordinary sum, with tracking estimates putting the daily cost in the hundreds of millions of dollars and dozens of vessels intercepted by American forces, several of them seized outright. Iran, for its part, retaliated in kind by seizing a small number of foreign cargo ships of its own, and the human toll across this entire period climbed steadily as well, with multiple merchant vessels damaged or abandoned, seafarers killed or reported missing, and dock workers caught in the crossfire at various ports around the region. So by the time this latest bridge came down, it was absolutely not an isolated standalone event happening out of nowhere. It was simply the next line item on a target list that had been building, brick by brick and corridor by corridor, for months. Each individual strike, viewed entirely on its own, might look like an isolated tactical action with limited broader significance. But stacked together across an entire spring and summer, the underlying pattern becomes unmistakable. A slow, sustained, almost patient effort to make it functionally impossible for goods, fuel, people, and forces to move freely anywhere inside the country without enormous cost and delay. That full context is precisely why Tehran's silence following this particular strike stands out so sharply against everything that came before it in this same conflict. Here is where this story becomes genuinely fascinating, because under almost any other circumstance over the past several months, Tehran has responded fast. Statements within hours of a strike, warnings of imminent retaliation, sometimes actual counterstrikes launched before the dust from the original attack has even fully settled. This time, Nothing. No statement, no warning, no counterstrike, no acknowledgement at all in the immediate aftermath. And there are three competing theories currently circulating among analysts and regional observers about exactly why that is. Theory number one is strategic silence. Under this reading, Tehran is deliberately withholding any public comment because acknowledging the loss out loud, in detail, would hand Washington a clear psychological victory it has no interest in conceding. Silence, under this theory, is a controlled decision rather than any kind of weakness, a calculated refusal to give the other side the emotional reaction it's clearly hoping to provoke. Governments engaged in long, grinding conflicts sometimes learn over time that the loudest possible reaction is exactly what an adversary wants to see broadcast, precisely because it signals distress and provides useful propaganda material. Denying them that visible reaction under this framing becomes its own quiet form of resistance and discipline, a way of refusing to hand the enemy a win they can point to. Theory number two is internal paralysis, and this is the considerably darker interpretation currently being floated. A second group of analysts point directly to mounting reports of leadership disruption and internal disagreement inside the Iranian government following months of sustained losses, stacking up simultaneously across the naval, economic, and now infrastructure fronts all at once. Under this theory, the silence isn't a deliberate strategy at all. It's simply that no single figure within the current government currently commands enough authority or enough internal consensus among competing factions to issue an official response on behalf of the state. And that absence of a single unified voice is itself a meaningful signal of just how much the internal command structure has eroded since this war first began back in February. A government that genuinely cannot agree internally on what to say publicly has, in a very real sense, usually already lost more ground internally than the specific bridge it happens to be staying quiet about on this particular day. Theory number three is negotiation posture. And this is the most cautiously optimistic of the three readings. A third camp of analysts suggests the silence is actually deliberate positioning ahead of back-channel diplomatic talks that may already be quietly underway, entirely out of public view. If Tehran is privately signaling some openness to a form of de-escalation to intermediaries or third-party negotiators, then a loud, defiant public response to yet another significant infrastructure loss would directly undercut that private signal to the parties sitting on the other side of any table. Staying quiet, under this particular theory, is not the absence of a message at all. It is, in fact, the message itself, just one directed carefully at an audience the general public simply cannot see or verify from the outside. So which of these three theories is actually correct? Nobody outside the actual rooms where these decisions get made genuinely knows for certain yet, and it's worth being fully honest about that uncertainty rather than pretending otherwise for the sake of a cleaner narrative. But here's the through line worth carrying with you for the remainder of this video, regardless of which theory eventually turns out to be closest to the truth. Whether Tehran is being coldly strategic, genuinely paralyzed internally, or quietly negotiating behind closed doors, the silence itself is already doing real, measurable work in this moment. It is actively shaping how this entire episode gets interpreted by everyone watching closely right now, from allied governments deciding how much continued support to offer, to adversaries deciding exactly how much harder to keep pushing while resistance appears minimal, to ordinary Iranian civilians on the ground trying to figure out for themselves whether their own government still has any coherent plan left at all. Now let's put some real numbers on exactly what was lost here, because this is where the true weight of this particular strike becomes genuinely impossible to ignore or wave away as merely symbolic. Rebuilding a structure of this specific engineering complexity is not a matter of weeks, and realistically, it likely isn't even a matter of a few months either. Engineers familiar with the original construction process have suggested that a full replacement could reasonably take years, given the highly specialized cable and arch support system originally involved, and the near-total destruction visible in the main span after the strike. In the meantime, every single truck and every commuter vehicle that used to cross this river in a matter of minutes now faces lengthy, often multi-hour detours instead, adding significant time onto ordinary daily trips, driving up fuel costs across an entire region, delaying commercial deliveries, and disrupting the basic daily routine of a population that had built its habits and schedules around this one specific crossing point for years. And this bridge was never inexpensive to build in the first place, even before a single missile was involved. Infrastructure megaprojects on this particular scale typically run into the hundreds of millions of dollars in construction cost alone, well before you even begin factoring in demolition, debris clearance, engineering redesign, and the compounding political cost of losing a second major symbolic structure on this exact same corridor within a single calendar year. Now place that enormous rebuilding bill directly alongside the cost of the strike itself. A relatively small handful of precision-guided munitions delivered in just 2 coordinated waves, separated by roughly an hour, represents little more than a rounding error next to a mega bridge replacement project, stretching potentially years into the future. That stark asymmetry is genuinely the same pattern that has defined nearly every single phase of this broader conflict from the very beginning. Cheap naval mines, costing as little as tens of thousands of dollars apiece, managed to force a multi-month, multi-billion-dollar naval clearance operation involving destroyers, specialized mine countermeasure ships, and cutting-edge autonomous underwater drones. A single coordinated night of drone strikes elsewhere in this broader regional standoff inflicted billions of dollars in warehouse and logistics damage on an adversary's economy at a fraction of the cost to launch. Destruction, again and again throughout this entire year, has proven itself to be remarkably cheap to inflict. Rebuilding trust, physical infrastructure, and basic public confidence has proven, every single time, to be exactly the opposite. Now zoom all the way out for a moment, because this single bridge fits into something considerably larger than one isolated strike happening in a vacuum. This is now the second major highway bridge on this exact corridor to be taken fully out of operation this year alone. Combine that specific fact with the ongoing strikes on southern rail and port infrastructure, the earlier hits on regional power generation capacity, and the naval blockade that has been running in close parallel to all of it. And what emerges when you step back is a genuinely systematic, patient effort to squeeze every single major artery Iran depends on to move people, fuel, and material internally, all without ever requiring a single conventional ground invasion of Iranian territory. Military analysts studying this entire campaign closely describe it as a deliberate, calculated evolution in how modern coercive military pressure gets applied against a determined adversary in the current era. Rather than relying purely on attrition against soldiers and military equipment, you instead target the connective tissue an entire national economy relies on to function. And you allow the accumulating internal pressure to do the rest of the strategic work gradually over time. It is undeniably slower than a single dramatic knockout blow delivered all at once. But it is arguably far more effective over the long run at eventually forcing a government to the negotiating table, because every additional week that passes without any resolution simply adds another few $100 million onto a reconstruction bill that only ever continues to grow larger, never smaller. So where does all of this leave us heading into the next several days and weeks? Watch closely for whether Tehran eventually breaks its current silence, and just as importantly, pay close attention to exactly how it chooses to do so. A sudden retaliatory strike answers one specific kind of question about the government's remaining capability and appetite for confrontation. A calm, formal diplomatic statement answers an entirely different question about its current posture and intentions. And continued silence, stretching past a certain point, several more days without any acknowledgement at all, starts to look considerably less like calculated strategic restraint, and considerably more like confirmation of theory number 2, genuine internal disarray at the very highest levels of government. Watch the reconstruction announcements closely, too, because if state media continues to stay conspicuously quiet specifically on rebuilding timelines for this bridge, that particular silence often signals the government itself simply doesn't yet have a workable plan in place, which in turn tells you something important about exactly how stretched available resources have become after months of parallel, simultaneous losses across the naval, economic, and now transport fronts all hitting at once. And finally, watch very closely whether this ongoing campaign expands further to a genuine third target somewhere along this same broader corridor. Because if the pattern firmly established earlier this year continues to hold true, these particular infrastructure strikes have rarely, if ever, stopped at just 2 before moving on to a third. So let's bring all of this together into one final picture. A government that has answered nearly every single significant strike this year with words, with warnings, or with direct military retaliation, just absorbed the loss of its last major bridge on this entire corridor and responded with absolutely nothing at all. Not necessarily because there's genuinely nothing left to say on the matter, but very possibly because saying anything at all, right now, in this specific moment, costs considerably more strategically than simply staying quiet ever could. Sometimes the loudest possible message a government can send to the rest of the world is no message whatsoever. And right now, coming directly out of Tehran, that particular silence is speaking louder than any official statement possibly could have. What do you personally think is really behind it? Strategic restraint, genuine internal chaos, or a quiet signal being sent ahead of negotiations nobody's publicly talking about just yet? Let me know. Down in the comments below, I genuinely read as many of them as I possibly can. If this breakdown helped you understand a part of this ongoing story that genuinely isn't getting the coverage it deserves elsewhere, do me a quick favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of deeper, more detailed analysis reach more people who would find real value in it. Subscribe if you want to keep tracking exactly how this entire campaign continues to unfold in the weeks ahead, because based on everything we've seen play out consistently this year, this almost certainly will not be the last bridge to end up on the list. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the very next one.